Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the 2025 Giller Book Club. My name is Jacob Alvarado, and I'll be your host for tonight. Just a couple quick reminders before we get things going. First of all, please make sure to have your Zoom on a side-by-side view for the best possible viewing experience. Also note that our conversation is going to be followed by a Q&A period, so if you have any questions, please make sure to submit them using the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. It's now my profound pleasure to introduce our interviewer for this evening, Karma Brown. Karma Brown is the author of 6 novels, the #1 international bestseller, Recipe for a Perfect Wife, Come Away With Me, a Globe and Mail Best Book of 2015, Globe and Mail and Toronto Star bestsellers, The Choices We Make, In This Moment, The Life Lucy Knew, and most recently, What Wild Women Do. She's also the author of the nonfiction bestseller, The 4% Fix, How 1 Hour Can Change Your Life, and co-authored 2 rom-coms under the pen name Maggie Knox. An award-winning journalist, Karma has also been published in Self, Redbook, and Chatelaine, among others. She lives just outside Toronto with her husband, teenage daughter, and a Labradoodle named Fred. Karma is currently working on 2 upcoming novels, The Christmas Cure, which is a holiday rom-com written as Christine Winters that comes out in October of this year, and her debut horror novel, The Mother, which is slated for publication in spring 2026. Tonight, Karma will be interviewing Shashi Bhat, whose electric story collection, Death by a Thousand Cuts, was longlisted for the Giller Prize last year. Now, without further ado, I'll hand things over to Karma and Shashi. Take it away, guys.
Thank you, Jacob. Hi, Shashi. How are you?
Hi. Good. How are you?
Good. So I'm just going to let people know a little bit more about you, and then I'm going to have you read a little bit from your amazing book, and then we'll get right into the questions. Okay?
Sounds good. Thanks.
Great. Shashi Bhat is the author of the novels The Family Took Shape, the finalist for the Thomas Rattle Atlantic Fiction Award, and The Most Precious Substance on Earth, a finalist for the Governor General's Award for Fiction. Death by a Thousand Cuts is her first book of short fiction. Her stories have won the Writers' Trust McClelland Stewart Journey Prize and have been shortlisted for a National Magazine Award and the RBC Bronwyn Wallace Award for Emerging Writers, and appeared in such publications as Hazlitt, The Fiddlehead, the Malahat Review, Best Canadian Stories, and the Journey Prize Stories. Shashi holds an MFA from the Johns Hopkins University and a BA from Cornell University. She lives in New Westminster, BC, where she's the editor-in-chief of Event Magazine and teaches creative writing at Douglas College. Welcome, Shashi. I'm so happy to be here talking to you tonight about your amazing book. Yeah. Here it is. Just hold it up.
Oh yeah, I have my copy too.
Oh,
Mine
yeah.
has a lot of flags.
Look at all
in
your,
it now.
yeah, actually I dog-ear my pages, which I know is very controversial, but that's how I do it. So there's lots of dog ears in here. Why don't you have a section that you'd like to read? So why don't we start with that whenever you're ready?
Thanks. Okay, so it's just a short little section from the story, Her Ex Writes a Novel. And so some context for anyone who's watching this who hasn't read it. You might be able to guess what it's about from the title, but it's about a woman who discovers her ex-boyfriend from 10 years earlier has written and widely published a novel about their breakup. And I think the only other context for this that you need is she's kind of struggling with like what she should do. Should she read it? And she's also working on her own kind of revenge story about him writing about her. So this is kind of from the middle of Her Ex Writes a Novel. It is not so surprising what he has done. In graduate school, shortly after they began secretly seeing each other, he wrote a story featuring barely concealed versions of several of his classmates, including assessments of the women's bodies, an evaluation of whether or not he considered them lovely, and a long scene where he tried to talk a young woman in the program into sleeping with him. The story was elegant and callous, boldly misogynistic. He depicted himself as a tragic romantic male figure. He submitted it to workshop during the week she was responsible for leading the discussion. She tried to be cool about it. She believed his cruelty was a phase, that he was a top-notch person and she had just encountered him in the wrong slice of time, and that if she was patient, his goodness would emerge again. It is startling to realize he was almost 30 then, old enough to think of other people. The professor asked her to start by reviewing the story aloud for them page by page. She had spent the previous night restless with dread, hoping she would wake up the next day and people would be magically kinder. It was a punishment, having to print out the story and study and reflect on it as a work of art. This document that hadn't been designed to hurt her. It was worse than that. He hadn't thought of her at all. During the critique, she would not show emotion, instead, immense, eerie clarity. She would focus on the writing. That was what mattered. Balancing praise with constructive criticism, she spoke only of the work's execution and not of its inspiration or intent, while the whole class watched and listened, everyone except the professor aware it was a true story. What were they thinking about, she wonders, as she complimented its lucid prose, its unexpected swerve towards direct address at the end. She remembers pointing at a line of dialogue and saying, "I didn't want to like that line, but I did." That was the nearest she got to revealing how she felt. There was professionalism in how she handled herself, but also vanity. She would not break. She glanced up from the papers in her hands and caught the eye of a male classmate who nodded at her with an approval that made her complicit. She now understands their lives were like two different films. His about which women in the program would or wouldn't sleep with him. Hers about loneliness and sadness and unmet expectations and the fear that this was what adulthood would be like. In her emails from that time, she sounds so young. It's embarrassing. When did her emails stop sounding young? The trouble is that she wants to read his novel, as she used to perversely anticipate his workshop stories, and not because they were well written, though yes, they were, but for the insight into his thoughts and feelings, for the ache of trying to guess which parts were true. Has she used people from real life in her fiction? Yes, she has. In each case, disguised or with permission, or in a flattering portrayal, or cut and pasted into Frankenstein. Her story includes no identifying physical details, no names of cities, no insight into the birthplace of his ancestors. The only person who could recognize him is himself, and those aware of how thinly veiled his fiction is, and he would only recognize himself from his actions. Is this ethical? She isn't sure. But her story is only the natural consequence of what he has done. If he, one, happens to read it, and two, challenges her depiction of him, by even acknowledging it, he will have admitted to his behavior. She will respond, "What makes you think it's about you?" The story is both petty and ambitious. Of course, it is merely her version of events. Isn't that what all fiction is? One person's point of view, the lie through which we tell the truth? I'll stop there.
It's amazing. That is one of my favorites from the book, actually. And I don't
Thank
know.
you.
Yeah, and it's one of the last ones. Is it the last one? I can't remember now where it is in the book, but
It's further back in the,
it's
yeah.
pretty close. But it was just that, like, the spiral that she's going through as she's trying to ignore this thing that has happened, but then it just can't. It just becomes this obsession. It was really I related a little bit, I think, as a writer too. It's
Mhm.
just that feeling of like looking at what other people are doing and wondering how you fit into that. Anyway, thank you for reading. That was great.
Oh, thanks so
Um,
much.
yeah, I'm going to go back to the beginning here for you and just ask
Okay.
you, how did you start doing this? Like, what is your author origin story or your writer origin story?
Oh, yeah. So just writing in general?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's start there. Yeah.
Sure, that's a great question. So I was, I guess, always someone who like enjoyed reading and writing, and like my parents aren't really readers, but we always had books in our house. Like I know our
Okay.
friend of my dad's gave him a box of books at some point, and there were a bunch of short story collections in there. So that was my first encounter with the short
Yeah.
story. It had a lot of classic short stories in it, like Edgar Allan Poe and like James Joyce, but also some
Mm.
Canadian short stories, so like W.P. Kinsella and um, trying to remember who else, but Alice Munro and ones like that. So I feel like I was exposed to the short story pretty early and became quite attached to it. um,
Interesting. Yeah.
yeah, and then I was pre-med in undergrad, but I was also an English major, and there just came a point where I decided like I want to do this. Like I want to be a writer. My parents were not
So
happy with
you
me.
you were pre-med and English major like simultaneously. Those are
Yeah, so
two really different paths.
yeah, it gave me something to write about, I guess, at least
Yeah.
initially. Yeah, and then so I ended up getting an MFA in creative writing rather than going to med school.
rather going to medical school. Well, you know what? I think it was a good call because
Oh,
look at what
thanks.
you have created. Yeah, I mean,
Maybe not
it's not just,
financially.
well, yes, but I think there's a lot of joy in writing and creating. And if you are someone who wants to do that and have that creative outlet, like you have to follow it. It's really hard. It is a hard industry to be in. It's a hard job to have because it requires a lot of you and it is a tough business to make money in. And, but it does give you a lot back, right?
Yeah, I joke about it, but really it's the best decision I have ever made. I've never once regretted it.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, good. Well, I'm glad to hear that. And you've written novels before, and this is your first short story collection, right?
Mhm.
So, but interesting that you have this history of reading all these short stories as a kid or being exposed to them that way. And so what was in terms of writing novels and short stories, like how has that experience been different for you? And what do you really love about this short story format?
Yeah, well, shorts, I've always thought of myself as a short story writer, even though my previous two books were novels.
No.
I feel like they were short stories that were stitched together into novels or
Ah,
novels and stories. And so I was really excited to have the chance to write a pure short story collection. I think there's this opportunity for experimentation in a short story collection, just partly because you don't have to commit to,
yeah.
a craft experiment for 300 pages. So
Yeah.
like with this book, I was trying out like different tones and perspectives and styles. Like Her Ex Writes a Novel is more expository than I would
Yep.
usually go. I have different points of view. So just getting to try out different things. But like the short story form itself, I really love for its artfulness. Like it feels like a tightrope walk to me, that like showcase of the narrative arc and how there's that tendency towards omission where you have what's on
Hmm.
the page, but then there's the suggestion of everything that's beyond what you see on the page. And what I love most about the short story is its ending. When I teach creative writing, so when I talk about the narrative arc in a short story with my students, I always tell them, like in a novel, you get the full narrative arc with
Yeah.
the winding down and the
The
resolution.
resolution. Yeah.
Whereas in a short story, I feel like it ends up here, closer to the climax, with that feeling of suspension or irresolution. And I think it has extraordinary potential for emotional impact with that, like gut punch style ending.
Yeah. And also though, it's still so satisfying. I mean, that's the interesting thing. I find I have never written a short story. I've written so many different kinds of books and in different genres,
Mm.
but I'm terrified of the short story. And because I don't really know how to get everything you want to say or to pick the spot in the story that you want to tell. Because you
Mm.
don't get that resolution at the end, but it does still feel satisfying. It feels complete. So it is a real skill to be able to write stories this way, where you're spending a few pages with this character or these characters, and then you are just able to move on, turn the page, and go to the next story, but feel that you've
Mm.
had this really nice moment with these characters. So, on that note, do you think that any of the characters in your story have more to say than what you gave them space for here? Like, would you maybe ever take one of them and try to turn their story into something longer format, say a novel?
Yeah, I got a similar question just yesterday because I
Oh, really?
went to the University of the Fraser Valley and I got to talk to a bunch of students there. And I was thinking about this, and I think a lot of times I write a short story where I just have this like one idea or this one
Mm,
like incident maybe or something like that that I want to depict. And then once the story is done, it's out and that's over, and it's not so much about the character. But I think
right.
the exception in this collection is probably Deal Breaker, because that I think I like the character. Maybe it's a little more about the character than some of the other stories are. I'm reconsidering that as I'm saying it. But I also think it would just be kind of fun to write that character going on a bunch of different dates. I think that there's like a
Yeah,
lot of material to be mined there.
there is. Yeah, that would be a good one. Anyway, I'm here for it if you decide to do that. So it sounds like there's a bit of a mind meld going on around this, and that now that you've had that question twice in 2 days, it's clearly a sign that you need to just consider it a little more seriously. So we'll stay tuned for that. But in terms of the title of all the stories that you have in here, maybe you can tell us a little bit about what this title means for you, Death by a Thousand Cuts, and maybe why you chose it. Titles can be an interesting thing on books, and so there's probably a story to your title, I would imagine.
There
Yeah,
is, because it wasn't
yeah.
the original title. The working title was "We're All in This Alone," which is the name of one of the other
Ooh, that's,
stories.
yeah, that's good,
And
good
it's
title.
a much sadder, bleaker title. But my publisher
I don't
had
know. This
published
has
another
death
book.
in it, Shashi. This is the word death in it. So carry on.
Yeah, like a little bit of a tonal difference, I guess.
Yeah.
Yeah, but my publisher had published another book called "We're All in This Together" just a couple of years earlier, and so they thought that might be confusing. Although I just think it's so funny, and that's why I like to tell this story, is because like they seem to represent totally opposite worldviews. But so yeah,
Yeah.
I guess I kind of looked at the titles of the other stories and thought about which one has a resonance that kind of captures the
Mm,
book. And I thought Death by a Thousand Cuts was a good one. It might have been my editor's suggestion originally. And I think that title, I like it more now. Because I think it has like a boldness and sharpness to it, and
yeah.
suggests this theme of like accumulating small harms and injustices that become
Hmm.
ultimately devastating. And I think, yeah, I think that theme is present in some way in every story in the
In
book.
every
Yeah.
story.
And
Yeah,
it's
it's a
also a
great
Taylor
title.
Swift song,
Of course.
which
I
I
am a
didn't know at the
Swiftie.
time.
Oh, yes. So I'm a Swiftie, so did know that. But yeah, no, it's a great title. But titles are so interesting, and I always like to ask where that title came from, because usually there
Yeah.
is a story to it, that it wasn't the first one. And but yeah, I think it suits the book really well. And your work really highlights all these themes of like aloneness and intimacy and that sort of harmful inner self-talk that women in particular seem to subscribe to, the microaggressions that women feel, just out in the world on a daily basis. And the stories are also so relatable. Like, I really could see parts of myself in every one of the women, despite the fact that our lives look completely different. I had a feeling of being able to relate to their experience just through my own experiences. So how did you create such unique stories and characters that at the same time feel very universal? Was that, I assume there's some purpose to that, or it maybe just came all together like that for you, but maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's so interesting to me, because I get that people telling me that they can relate to it or they see themselves
Mhm.
in it, and that really means a lot to me. And I don't even know if I set out to do that as much as I was just like writing about experiences that upset me. Although
Mm,
I do think that like thinking about the Me Too movement, and I think, my book and my previous book too kind of like reflect on that.
yeah.
That feeling of like, oh, I thought this was just my experience, but actually it's the experience of many people and just hasn't really been spoken about widely.
Hmm.
And I think those are the kinds of things that I'm writing about. I also think I'm often kind of projecting myself into a story, even if it's not, true or autobiographical, but just this kind of
Yeah.
like extrapolation of a feeling, and maybe that's just something that other people have been feeling. I think I also spend a lot of time reading about women's experiences. Embarrassingly, it's often on Reddit, but I read essays written by women and books written by women, and I think part of that maybe like lends itself to the feeling of universality.
Do you spend a lot of time on Reddit? Is this like a,
Too much time, yeah, I have to block it on my
are
phone
you, do you,
sometimes.
I have never used Reddit. I have been on to read a few things, but do you participate? Like, do you have like a anonymous name that you are on
There was
there
a
participating?
There was a period when I did, and now I've kind of
Yeah.
stopped again. But like, I think once you start, it becomes a little addictive.
Right. And then I'm sure it's like you just go in and you find something here and then you carry on and you find another thing here. I'm sure it can just really suck you in for a long
Yeah.
time.
And
You
it's
find a
also surprising to me because I always was a little skeptical of it, or not even like distrustful of it and
yeah.
scornful because of what I had heard about the misogyny on there. But
Mm,
like there are these little enclaves of women and very like supportive groups of women that I've found surprising and interesting and eye-opening in some cases.
okay. There's probably a lot of material on there too to just
Yeah.
generate some ideas for future short stories or novels. Um, so the blend of like dark humor and emotional vulnerability in your work, it feels particularly resonant for women. And how did you strike that balance? Because you laugh in this book, but then like I felt a lot of things. There was a lot of empathy and like the giantess, is that the title of the, that one really, I don't know. That one was just like that one got to me. I really felt for her and just wanted it to be easy for her, but it was also funny at the same time. So it was just this lovely balance that you have. I think through every story you were striking that balance, and maybe just like how is it a feeling that you have as you're writing? Is it a purposeful decision that you're making?
Yeah, I think it is intentional, but it's like actually I feel like my real origin story is I tell this story a lot, so I'm like, oh, should I say it? But it's
Tell us, please,
I
please.
I used to write these really serious kind of descriptive stories, and they were like lyrical and stories about being the child of immigrants and immigrant families.
Hmm.
And it was kind of what I thought I was expected to write because of the kinds of
Hmm.
books by people of color that were being published at the time. This was when I was in my early 20s. And then I did this reading at a bar in grad school where the audience was just like, I just knew they weren't going to be into that. Like it was our pre-med students who didn't read
Yeah.
fiction. So I wrote a story that had jokes in it and pop culture references, and I wanted it to be accessible and kind of entertaining. But I also knew that I wanted there to be a point where it pulls the rug out from under the reader
Hmm.
and turns into something like dark and unexpectedly real. And I just remember the audience reaction was so palpable. Like there was a point when a woman in the audience gasped and said, "Oh no." And I was like, "Oh, like yes, like
I
this
did
is
it.
fiction. Like this is what you can do
Yeah.
with fiction." And
Yeah.
since then, I've often used humor in my writing, but in that way that's like it's a layer of humor over the true seriousness of the story, and I like to kind of control when it lifts to
Hmm.
like guide the reader reaction and keep them off guard maybe, and make it feel like when that humor lifts, something true is being revealed.
Yeah. And you do feel that through the stories. I mean, I think with short stories, you have much less time. So you have to be so nimble about how you control that through the story and help to guide that experience, I think, for the reader. You have a little more space in a novel, but in a short story, you really need to hit those beats.
Yeah,
Uh,
nimble is such a good word for it.
I use that word a lot. I don't know. It's one of my favorites, nimble. You're welcome to start using it as
I'm
you
going
like.
to.
Because, yes,
Thanks.
great. I'm so glad. um, so many of your stories really center on appearance and the way that women are perceived and treated. Like in Chicken and Egg, this woman whose hair is falling out is basically dismissed. Like her lived experiences of what's going on with her body are being dismissed, and she's sort of told to go rest and take a multivitamin, which I think that a lot of women have had an experience of being dismissed like that when they're seeking help because of this idea that, we are a little more hysterical about our health or about what's going on with us. And in Indian cooking, where the woman's face is burned when she's preparing food. And so then it really does take away this armor of beauty that she has had, and she becomes this quite different person who has a lot of rage. And I just was wondering if you could speak to what inspired you to make the theme of, sort of the way that women are, the way they see themselves and the way that they're being seen by society as being central to all of your stories. I mean, that really is part of each one of the stories in this book.
Yeah, that's such a yeah, I like that parallel because those two stories do feel like they have that in common to me, the way like a woman's identity can be so tied up in her appearance or her
Appearance.
body in general. And
Mhm.
I can't even remember why I started writing the chicken and egg, like about the woman losing her hair. Like I can't remember where the initial idea came from. There was a period where I was losing my hair, though not at all to this extent, and I think that
Yeah.
might have prompted it. But what I wanted to write about there was just this kind of a horror story, which is why I was interested to learn that you write horror also,
Yeah.
because that was kind of the tone I was going for, like a horror story
Yeah.
about woman navigating the healthcare system and being essentially gaslit by her
Yes.
doctor. And I think it does, like she talks about how it's her one beauty, like what is it, like, you have average brains, you're only sometimes funny, but your hair. Sure, she has many other positive qualities too, but it's like she fixates on that.
Yeah.
And it's kind of a loss of femininity for her too. Other people start to treat her differently. And I think that also happens in Indian cooking, the way other people respond to that woman who is disfigured after she's deep frying and there's an accident that causes severe burn.
Shashi, are you there?
Burns on her face. And I
Oh,
think it both changes the
Shashi.
way other people respond.
Oh, hello, Shashi. Sorry, everyone. Just trying to figure this out.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me? Okay. We're back. Are you
Hi.
back?
Am I
Hi,
back? Oh,
you're
sorry about
back.
that. I think it's just my internet.
I don't know. I mean, we were talking that this never happens, right? And then this happened, but I
Oh
I
no.
hope that we're all back and everyone is okay and good. There we go. Just a small, just a small pause. Okay, so you were talking about how it really changed her identity when she became disfigured, and then I couldn't hear anything after that.
Yeah. Um, Let me see. And then, yeah, just the way she perceived herself changed too, because she was always kind of had
Mhm.
this identity as a beautiful woman. But I think it's kind of sad, like how those women become so like that's everything to them when that one thing about them, their appearance changes.
And then really, they're so focused on their appearance after it changes. It's almost like there's no peace from that because it becomes your whole identity if you have this one thing like the woman who's losing her hair and seeing it as her one true, beauty part of her, and then it goes away, and she's just so focused and obsessed with losing it, and that becomes
Mm.
her identity. And same with the woman in Indian cooking, it just she almost can't find out who she is without that.
Yeah, and finds such a strange, caustic way of coping with it, with her
Yeah.
sense of humor. And with that story, there's also the daughter who kind of has to witness it. And there I
Hmm.
was thinking about like, what responsibility do you have to the people around you when you're going through
Hmm.
something like that? And I think it's complicated by the fact that the narrator is a child and it's her daughter.
It, yes. Yeah. And do you have a favorite story in this collection? Like, do you
Oh,
have, I know we're not supposed to pick our favorite children, but do you have a favorite story?
Mine, it might be the last story. Am I the asshole? Yeah,
Oh, yes.
either that or her ex writes a novel.
Okay. And I know people probably ask you this all the time because I get this question all the time. How much of this story is autobiographical? And uh, for me personally, almost none of it. of what I write is autobiographical at all. But I just wondered for you if there are parts of you in these stories, or how much of you is in stories.
Yeah, there are, but less than people seem to assume. And I think it's because I often write characters who are South Asian women. Even my own friends think it's autobiographical when it's not. Like I went for drinks with some friends after like one of them had read it, and she starts like she had met previous people I'd been in relationships with, and she was like, "Oh, is this Phil? And is this no, these are fictional characters." But like just making those assumptions, which I thought was alarming, honestly.
Yeah, because then you
Um,
wonder what other people might be thinking about, who these people are, if people are actually trying to figure that out. Yeah.
yeah, and what strangers think of me now after reading this book too.
The only one for me that I was like, is this autobiographical, was the one about her ex writes a novel. And only because there's so many similarities to you as a writer and, going through the coursework and being in classes. And so I was like, I wonder if that's,
Yeah, and with that story, I feel like I was kind of inviting that and playing with it
yeah,
also, like,
yeah,
and I think of that story as being metafiction about the ethics of autofiction and like knowing that people are
yeah,
going to read this as autobiographical. What can I do to kind of like play with that and just
play
have
with
fun
it.
with it?
Yeah. Well, this question I have is actually about that story, because um I find that like women's voices in fiction are so often expected to fit certain molds. Women need to be likable, and that's a word that's frequently used when discussing women characters,
Mhm.
right? You need your characters to be likable. And in her ex writes a novel, so I'll read just this little bit of that story. It says, after 10 years, is he still writing about their breakup? The synopsis indicates it's more about the aftermath, about brooding, binging, post breakup ennui, and then heroically moving on. About a man searching for love and its meaning. Why couldn't he have written about politics or geography? If a woman had written this novel, it would be categorized as women's fiction. When a man writes it, it's literature. And so many times I've had that very conversation about the differences between the way that women's writing and men's writing is perceived, and women's fiction, and there's no such thing as men's fiction. And I just wondered if you were consciously working to resist writing into the expectations that are held for women writers, for women writing fiction.
Yeah, and I think also my like my own expectations or like expectations that I felt like, well, I guess I mentioned earlier, like based on my ethnic identity being expected to
Yeah.
write a certain thing, but also gender, also writing like literary fiction, which is that weird term. But like,
Hmm.
I have a lot of pop culture and jokes, and I write about app dating and this stuff that isn't really taken seriously. And I just have this feeling of like, why can't I? Like, this is the world we live in. Why would I leave all of that out so I can be perceived as writing serious fiction? So I think in that way I am writing against
You are.
expectations. And yeah, like I want to write about women's lives. I think, yeah, just because they're women shouldn't mean that they're taken less seriously, obviously.
Obviously, yeah, but I do think that that is something that can happen, and probably more so in a commercial fiction sphere than in the literary fiction. But it still is. I laughed out loud when I got to that line, because I have had that exact conversation with
Hmm.
so many authors I know, and so it was just so interesting to see it there. Which then is why I was like, I wonder how autobiographical this is. So that was interesting to hear you
Yeah.
talk about.
Like what would men's fiction be?
Well,
What
this
would
is the
that
thing.
category?
Someone tell me, what is it? Is there a shelf talker at Indigo that tells us what is men's fiction? No.
Just like Hunter S.
So
Thompson.
I don't even know. If anyone knows, please put it in the Q&A box, and let us know what it is. But and I heard or read, I remember that Giantess was originally told from the point of view of a man, and you
Yeah.
changed it. So what happened there? Why did you decide to do that? And why did you start first with the male perspective and then switch?
Yeah, well, that story was inspired by a student I had it's almost 20 years ago now in Halifax. And he told me his nickname was the library giant. He worked in a
Oh,
library, and the story, like the character's not related to him at all, but just that
mm,
nickname suggested to me a character. And it also, like, I just thought it was so sad and beautiful, like a giant who works in the library.
yeah.
So I wrote, it was just a little piece of flash fiction. And it wasn't but a giant getting stuck in an elevator too. I don't know why that was that. Maybe I had taken an elevator in a library or something.
Oh, that stressed
Um,
me out. That part of the story was so stressful. I'm just going to say, I was like, please let her get out of this elevator because she's missing the thing. I have dreams like this where I'm trying to get somewhere and I'm stuck in an elevator or,
oh yeah, I have those dreams too. Not the
yeah.
elevator, but yeah, so I wrote it as flash fiction. It was actually like for a performance that I did with this. I had some friends in a band and they wrote music to
Oh,
go with it. So
wow.
it was like its own thing,
Oh,
and then it was
wow.
done. Um, and
Is that
then
something we can see if we go on YouTube and search around for the
I don't think it was
musical version of this
recorded.
flash fiction? That's
It was
fascinating.
really cool though. It was like almost like program music where they designed it to kind of go with the character.
Oh, that's
But yeah,
great.
then I did expand it into a full-length story just because I kind of liked the character and I liked that
Yeah.
pathos. And it was still a male protagonist. And then when I was putting together this collection, at some point, I decided, okay, this book is going to be about women. It has female protagonists.
Hmm.
But I was attached to that story and I wanted to keep it. So I asked my agent, like, okay, I'm just going to try rewriting this from a female perspective. And I think it ended up working better because now it maybe has more thematic resonance where it's about a woman who is afraid to take up space. And the story
Mm.
changed a little bit. Like I think changing the gender did change some aspects of the character too, in a way I found interesting.
Yeah, and it is true that that whole conversation about women taking up space and are we allowed to take up space and how much space and do we try to make ourselves smaller or how should we be walking that line? And so that making her a giant and putting her in these most awkward situations as she tries to just be friends with people, make friends, and as an adult, making friends is like it can be a tricky thing because there just isn't anyone setting up play dates for you and you have to really do the work on your own. But she was just so earnest in that story and trying to find her way through the intimacy that already existed in those relationships. So find a piece of that for herself. So anyway, that one stuck with me. I've thought about that story
Oh,
quite
thank you.
a number of times since. But so what's next for you? Well, maybe before I ask what's next, I would ask what is something that you would love to write that you haven't done it yet, or is there something you have out there that it's sort of like one of those, maybe one day I'll do that.
Yeah, I actually would really like to try writing horror
Oh,
someday. I don't have
I'm
an
here for
idea
it.
yet. But I read a lot of Stephen King as a child and I watch a lot of horror
Yeah.
movies and I'm like, there must be something in me that could do it. But yeah, I'm waiting for the idea.
There is. Okay, well, as soon as you get it, please write it, and then I'm here to read it because I love reading and writing horror. So I'm looking forward to that, whatever it is, whenever it comes. So then in back to real life now, what is it that you're working on next?
Yeah, I am working on a novel, and it's the first time I've set out to like knowing from the beginning that I wanted it to be a novel. So it's a new structural thing for me, and it does touch on similar themes to the story collection. So like women navigating the healthcare system, women's
Mm,
pain, and women's independence and singlehood.
okay, I mean, you could maybe write that as a horror. As you said, you felt some inspiration when you were writing the one where she's losing her hair. So maybe, I don't know.
Yeah,
Have you
body
seen
horror
The
does.
Substance? Have you seen The Substance yet?
I actually haven't. I'm maybe the only woman who hasn't seen it yet.
You should see it, and maybe that will offer a little bit more inspiration. Here I am just pushing you into a horror direction when I know that you that may not be the right time. But yeah, I think that's an interesting topic for sure, and something that a lot of women are dealing with and feeling gaslit by the medical community, and what does women's pain look like, and how is it treated and handled. So look forward to it. We are about to go to Q&As, and I think that if you have questions for people listening, please put them into the Q&A box so that I can ask those questions. I just wanted to ask one more question though, in terms of your process and how you write, where you write, how you write, what time of day, do you have any particular beverages you need to have at the ready or snacks? Please tell us.
Once I have momentum, I'm just writing whenever I can, like, but in between doing other stuff. But
Yeah.
I have a routine where I do shut up and write meetings with friends. I do them like once or twice a week, where I have a bunch of writer friends and we meet in a cafe and we set a timer and we write for 45 minutes and then we socialize and we just keep alternating. Sometimes the social breaks kind of stretch out.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's really helpful to me to get work done, but also like just commiserate about writing sometimes.
Yeah, because it becomes so isolating when you're writing. And so to be able to look up from your laptop and to get just out of your story for a minute and have another experience, particularly a social interaction, if you're able to do that. I talk to my dog sometimes when I need to have that and there's no one around for me to have that moment, but it does allow the ideas to just then start to churn again, because you can get a little bit stuck. Are there no snacks or drinks?
No, I mean, I guess
You're
I'll
not a
have
snack
coffee.
person? Coffee. Okay.
I
Yeah.
can't eat and write at the same time. I just get distracted by the
No,
snacks.
I know. But coffee. Yes. Yeah. Okay. We have some questions. I'm going
Oh, nice.
to
Okay, let's
take
see.
a look here and get started.
Oh, there's so
So
many. Wow.
I
Okay.
know. So we're going to start. So from Carol, do you ever write about older women?
You know what? I don't think I have specifically. I do have a story where it's kind of a strange speculative story where a woman starts rapidly aging, but I also
Mhm.
think maybe I'm waiting till I have like had that experience, like till I am an older woman and can write about it authentically.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I understand. I mean, I'm now in my 50s, and life is different than it was, 20 years ago,
Mhm.
obviously, but it's just that lived experience does offer, just a little more for the story. But I still think you could actually do it. So, and again, that sounds like a perfect horror.
Yeah, and also like I got a really like lovely message from someone on Facebook recently. And she had read the story Chicken and Egg about the woman losing her hair. And
Mhm.
she wrote to me and said like she's 76 years old and that was the first time she saw her experience reflected. And I was really moved by that.
Mhm.
Especially by the fact that she wasn't the same age as me or my character, but it still like resonated with her.
Hmm. Yeah. Well, I think that's the thing. You can often see yourself in those stories. You have memories of that being your experience. And I think that if you're just someone who's looking, at the full experience of being a woman, what you're doing as you're writing these stories, you will tap into those moments and those themes regardless of age. But so thank you, Carol. This one's from Karen. I absolutely loved your collection of short stories. Thank you for writing them. My favorite part of reading short stories is that it feels like you're dropped in the middle of the lives of characters for a snapshot and then it ends, and so much room to interpret beyond the pages. How do you know when you've landed the end of the story?
Yeah. Oh, thank you, Karen. That's a great question. How do you know when you've landed the end of a story? It's a tough question to answer because I think I feel it in my body. Especially endings. Like there are other parts of a story where I, try things out and move things around, but
Mhm.
the ending is just like that gut instinct. For me, I do think it has to do with the narrative arc and having, like, I know it's going to end here. It's just a matter of kind of like calibrating it. And I do often like rewrite the wording of an ending many times. Like with her ex writes a novel, I rewrote that just one line, one sentence. I rewrote it probably a dozen times.
Mhm.
But yeah, I only knew it was over once I like felt it in my body, and my editor put yes in the margins of
Yeah,
it.
yeah.
Then I was like, okay, good, I got it.
Yeah, there is some alchemy that happens when you're writing. Like there is a rhythm of it. I find that at beginnings too, beginnings of stories. There's like
Mm.
this instinct that you have that, okay, this is the right thing. It's just this interesting feeling that you hope shows up. And if it hasn't, then you're like, okay, not done yet. Have to keep going on that one.
Yeah, and sometimes like you write the ending, but you don't quite feel it, and then I'll do like, can I remove a line or a paragraph, and does
Right.
that make that feeling come forward?
Yeah. Okay, this one's from Sandra. The first story as I read in this book just blew me away. I was gripped with such a visceral reaction that I had to stop reading anything at all for a couple of days. Ooh, you
Wow.
like, yeah. It's the best short story for me that I've ever read, period,
Oh,
exclamation
wow. Oh
mark.
my God.
So I began reading this book on a very high positive note, and I was not disappointed. I think the entire volume speaks so much to women and the vulnerability that is part of the female experience. You were speaking about the importance of the ending, and you have ended each one of them with such finesse and intelligence, and one is compelled to continue the story far beyond the printed word. You are a national treasure, exclamation mark. I agree. By the way, the first story in the book, Deal Breaker, is a horror story.
Yeah, it is. It is.
There
Yeah,
you
wow, it's like
go.
I planted my mother in the audience. That's so kind. Thank you.
Thank you for that one, Sandra. That was lovely, and I could not agree more. This one's from Elena. Okay, who are some of your favorite authors, inspirations, and what books would you recommend to us? Yes, great question.
Yeah, as for inspirations, I like there's so many I can think of, but there are a few short stories that I read early on that I keep returning to, and often it's because I love the ending so much.
Yeah,
Um, like Amy Hempel's In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson is Buried. I love that story.
I
And
don't
it's
know that one. I'm going to write it down. Sorry, can
it's
you
so
say it
good.
again so we can?
Sure,
What is it?
Amy Hempel's In the Cemetery Where Al Jolson is Buried. It's probably online.
Okay,
It's one of those like anthologized stories. Um,
okay.
and it's so like obliquely told. It references this story of a chimp who learns sign language, and the ending of it is the chimp signing to her baby who has just died. And she's signing, it's like baby come hug, fluent now in the language of grief. And I can't even like I can't even saying it now. I'm like, it's just
Oh,
devastating, that
oh
ending.
no.
And I feel like like hold that in my mind when I'm writing sometimes to
Mm,
capture the power of that ending. Similarly,
wow.
Tobias Wolff's Bullet in the Brain, the ending of that story, I think it's like so lyrical. And the way that story plays with time too, like stretches it and compresses it, and it's just like a masterpiece. Um, yeah, and that was one where I don't think I could recite it now, but at some point I memorized the ending of that story just to kind of like feel it. And
Yeah.
then one more would be Jhumpa Lahiri's The Third and Final Continent.
Okay.
That was probably the first story collection I read by someone with a similar background to me, not quite the same background, but
Mm,
and it was about like the main character is someone who kind of reminds me of my father, and I had just never seen that in fiction before, and it
mm.
was really meaningful to me. Also has a really beautiful ending.
So you really, the ending really is critical for you as a reader and a writer,
For
right?
sure.
Yeah. Okay, this next one is from Tian. I think that's how you say your name, Tian. How do you get to know your characters?
Yeah. How do I get to know my characters? Well, I think part of it is that like taking a piece of myself and projecting it or exaggerating. But then there are also like exercises that I do with my students that are things that I
Mm,
sometimes try out in my own writing. Like lately I've been having them do a character disruption exercise where they like put their character in the presence of another person, and it's like, how does the presence of that other person disrupt the character? How does that make them think or feel or do in a different way? And I think like with Deal Breaker, for example, it's a character who is like suppressing her instincts due to politeness and not wanting
Mm,
to like cause trouble when she's on this date. And so in a way, I think that man's presence is disrupting her. Yeah, how to get to know characters. And yeah, another exercise that I really like and have been doing with my students lately is like once they've written a first draft of a story, I give them 15 minutes to write 50 sentences about their character.
oh,
Um,
nice.
and they can't use the same sentence structure. So it can't be like, he is blank, he is blank. It has to be
Right.
like approaching it in different ways. And they can start by including things that they already know that are kind of in the story, but at some point they have to go beyond what's on that page. And then
Mm,
our next step is to go through and highlight the 10 sentences that most surprised you. And we talk about like, could these sentences enter the story? And if there's no room to actually put them in the story, like they're out of context or whatever, is there a way that they can still inform the story and suggest a life that's beyond the page? And I think that's what I think about with my characters too, is like, what is the life that we don't see, to give them
yes.
that feeling of being real people.
Being a whole person. And so do you
Mhm.
think you do a lot of that? Because I know that you do that with your students. So those are the actual exercises, but do you think that they are just in you now? And so it is a very natural part of your process to go through that without actually maybe
Mhm.
actively writing it all down, but just thinking it through?
Yeah, or even when my students are doing the exercise in class, I usually have scrap paper and I just start kind of like half doing the exercise or taking notes because it does it makes me feel like writing when they're writing.
Yeah. Oh, that's great. This one says, were your stories written far apart from each other or kind of in a shared time frame? Can you share a little bit about your process of writing a short story? Thank you.
Yeah, okay, written far apart from each other or in a shared time frame. So they were written over about a 15-year period. Like the earliest one was
Mhm.
probably 2007-ish. So some of them are quite old in cooking, though I did revise them pretty significantly to be in the book. Some of them were written closer together and more recently, like Her Ex Writes a Novel, Am I the Asshole, Deal Breaker. Those were all written in the past like 4 or 5 years, I would say. And then
Yeah.
for process of writing a short story, often it's like something happens that makes me kind of uncomfortable or stirs like a tension
Mhm.
of some kind. And when that happens, I'm always like, oh, how could I make this into a story? Or could this become a short story? And then I just save it and start accumulating other things. Like, I have
Mm.
a notebook and like phone
Yeah.
app and things. And then it's just like a matter of accumulating enough details that I can like form a shape out of it. I guess that shape is the narrative arc. So it does
Yeah.
take a little bit of time and percolation, but for me, most often it's a feeling of like discomfort or injustice.
Have you ever had a story that you just wrote, it just came to you and it just landed beautifully on the page the first time? Has that happened to you
The
before?
first, like with no revision at all.
Well, maybe it's lightly revised, but it sort of just arrived to you in a complete
Yeah.
narrative arc for that particular story. Has that
I
ever
actually
happened?
think I think Emma the Asshole is the one that's come closest to that
Mm,
because when I
that's a great story
revised
too.
it, thank you.
Yeah.
It didn't go through any major structural changes or like development. It was like I think I just had a strong conviction of what I wanted that story to be and do, and it has like kind of a shifting limited third and is kind of a he said she said story,
Hmm.
and it just like I had the kind of purpose of the story in mind, so in some ways it wrote itself.
Did you write that during COVID? Like, did you write it
I
during lockdown
think I
times?
did,
Because
yeah, or maybe shortly after.
they're in lockdown together, right? During that
Mhm.
story? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, this is from Elizabeth. Also, it was very cool. The substance was directed by a woman. So, as writers, can you offer any insight as to her thought process? And also, would it have had the same powerful message if a man was at the helm? I assume, Elizabeth, you mean for the substance. I haven't seen it, but the fact a woman called the shots is reason enough to give it a view. Yeah, and I know that, so I don't know, I know that you haven't seen it either, Shashi, but it's, so there has been some criticism about that movie that it is from the male gaze because it is so focused on women's bodies, and it is about aging, and it is about this desire we have as we age to go back to being young, and this impossible thing about I miss my body, my face, my whatever from being young, and just completely missing everything good that's happening to you here because you're living back here. But because it's so focused on the visual aspects of women and of bodies, I can see why people would say that. My argument is that it's not from the male gaze, or that is actually the point. It's like, this is what society is like, and this is what I believe she was trying to showcase by doing it that way. This is how women are seen. And so it's just more of a factual representation. It's excellent. Everyone should see it. It's very also gross. So if you are not someone who likes gross things, you can fast forward, but there are some pretty rough scenes there. Okay, thank you, Elizabeth. Is there a time of day that you like to write? If yes, why that time?
Morning. I'm a morning person. I wake up at like 5:30, and that's when my brain just works. Like after 3
Me
p.m., I'm just
too.
like,
Me
I can't.
too. Yeah.
Yeah, and usually during the school year, that means I'm grading. But if it's summer, then that's my writing time.
That's your writing time. That's great. Yeah, I'm an early morning writer too. I've always been sort of a 5 a.m. person. So usually by 3 o'clock, I'm also finished, and I have to just do, the little fiddly things that you need to do in a
Same,
day
yeah.
that, yeah, not the real creative, heavy lifting stuff. Okay, and now Elizabeth she just can clarify something here. She's saying it can also refer to an author creating the vision. So when you're looking at a story from the woman's perspective, and how do you think that? And I'm sort of trying to extrapolate what she's asking here, but here, there's another. Thank you, Elizabeth, for continuing to put the clarifications in, because this is helping me. My question is more about the storytelling, and that a woman is the storyteller. So just being able to write the experience of women. And like you said, Shashi, for so many of these stories, like, they're not you. This is not your personal experience that you've put into each one of these stories. That would, if this was all you, we'd be having a different
Memoir,
conversation.
yes.
But your ability to do that, so to see those universal themes, to take your own experience, to look at something that maybe you're curious about, or that is a pain point for you for one reason or another, and then to create the story of that woman, and how, maybe it's just like, what is important to you as you do that. Like, I know for me, it's important to write women's stories. Those are the only stories that I write, because those are the ones I want to write. And so, yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, and I think like even maybe to broaden the question, like I do also write about women primarily, and I think I'm also trying to write the story that only I can write. I don't know where I heard that advice, but like whether it's the way I reference pop culture, or the sense of humor, or or the women's experiences. I'm trying to just put myself on the page, because that's all I can do, right? Like that's what sets me apart from anyone else.
Right. Yeah. Yeah, I think that's true. That's a really good point to make around that question. This one's from Penny. I love short stories since reading Alice Munro stories in the 70s. Your stories captured my attention in a way that others haven't for quite a while. I felt I was living their experiences. How do you do that?
Thank
See,
you.
again.
Yeah, how? I don't know. Like, yeah, it's such a hard question to answer. I think I do often try to inhabit a character. Like when I'm writing a character's inner monologue, I try to think like this is my inner monologue, and like kind of pouring myself into it in that way. I also think like detail create realism in
Mm,
fiction. And so I try to be specific. I find when people think my stories are autobiographical, it's often because I've just put really specific details in there about
yeah.
like a coffee order or like some decor that's in the home or whatever. And even when I've just like made it up or a detail I've taken out of context and put it in the
Hmm.
story, I think that can create that feeling of realism.
Yeah. Yeah. There's one last question, and it's from Lori. And it says, do you find that the appropriate point of view for a story or character comes to you right away as you begin a story? Or do you have to spend a great deal of time trying to figure out which point of view would be best for your story?
Yeah, it's a good question. It varies. Like sometimes it just comes out the way it is. But for example, the story of Chicken and Egg, that one I wrote it originally in third person. It didn't feel uncomfortable in the way I wanted it to. So I rewrote it into first person, which made it more
Mm,
intimate, had more interiority. Still didn't feel quite right to me in terms of how unsettling it could be. So I rewrote it into second person, and that's when it really clicked. So it was multiple rounds of revision before I landed on the point of view. Sometimes it's, you get it on the first try, but sometimes I think it does take that effort.
yeah, I've had to redo entire novels when I've decided
Oh,
at the
yeah. Wow.
end that the point of view was not the right point of view. So sometimes
Wow.
you find out a little late, but yeah. Well, thank you. That is the end of our questions and the end of our chat. And it
Thank
was
you so
just so
much.
nice. Yeah, so great chatting with you.
That was awesome, guys. I like really, really enjoyed that conversation. I'm sure everybody else in the audience did too. Thank you all so much for all your questions. We got some really good questions today as well.
Mhm.
Just a few quick reminders before I let everybody go. If you know somebody who couldn't make it this evening, please let them know that this interview is going to be available on YouTube tomorrow. Please also join us in a couple weeks' time for our next Giller Book Club on Thursday, April 3rd. We're going to hear writer Drew Hayden Taylor interview Corinna Chong about Corinna's long-listed novel Badland. If you've already joined our mailing list, then you'll be sent a registration link for that right into your inbox. But if you haven't done that yet, then please head over to gillerprize.ca and sign up. That's all I have to say for tonight. So thank you all so much, and I hope you have a great rest of your evening. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.